So, I didn't do a perfect job explaining that. But the reason that I do this is because, for me, I think it's better that information is accessible and people just choose whether or not they want to access it. But without forcing them to. So I believe that deliberately withholding information is the same thing as forcing it onto someone because it takes away their choice. And that's not what God did. God didn't make it impossible for us to learn. He didn't make it impossible for us to find information. But he also didn't just hand it to us on a silver platter. He creates information like numbers and mathematics and logic and all these fields, I guess you would call them. And then he allows us to explore those fields. He doesn't pluck us and then place us somewhere. I can't even begin to accept that idea. Now, again, like I had said, there's really no way for me to perfectly describe any of this stuff. So, in part, in some way, yeah, it probably is, at least in small part, an influence from God to sort of nudge us toward or away from things. Maybe. But I personally don't like that view because I don't like the idea of being put somewhere. If I got put somewhere, then I'm just a passenger in the back seat of the car, just kind of looking out the window, wondering where Dad's driving me next. For what purpose? I have no clue. He won't tell me. And where are we going and when are we going to get there? No one fucking knows. And I just don't like that view. You know, some people do. Some people find that just absolutely grandiose, just paradisical. Yeah, I got put here. Okay, and then I don't have to worry about whether or not I'm doing anything wrong because everything that I do is right because God put it here for me. And I'm just sort of a surfer on a wave kind of a thing. And that's cool. That's cool for some people. I can get that. I can understand that. It's very comforting to think that there's someone out there that's just going to automatically force you to be perfect no matter what so that you're always okay. But then why are there some people like me who didn't get that? Why is it that God put you there, but he didn't put me here? Why is it that God put me in this life, in this fucked up scenario, but you got to have all that stuff? So, you know, when you start looking at the whole big picture, none of our ideas will make it. My idea doesn't make it either. It's just as ridiculous and silly as whoever it is that has that idea of being put in places by God. It's just as ridiculous as believing that I have total control over where I go. They're both equally stupid, but that's the only way that we can formulate ideas here. We can't figure out exactly how to put it where it's like, well, it's a ratio. It's partly me and it's partly God. And we don't really have a way of analogizing that. Maybe like a conversation, like this conversation, I'm nudging you towards a particular view, but you're also nudging yourself towards a particular view. And all the people that have ever interacted with you before, are also nudging you towards other locations. And then there's also God. And then there's also the devil. And there's all kinds of, and the demiurge. And there's all kinds of different influences on people. And to try to figure out exactly what percentile or percentage ratio there are of influences in between all these characters, we can't do that math. And I don't care how sophisticated you get, but that's the real answer, is that everybody's influencing everybody. God is doing this, and then there's that question. What about God? So this is where I had previously gotten really scared, is what about God? So God is timeless, and the reason that we know that that's true is because God created time. So in order to create time, you'd have to be timeless. So this is what I believe. This is my religion. I believe that God always existed. and there's no time in which God did not exist, and there is no creator of God. God, being the soul whose faith is absolutely unwavering, is the only soul in existence that has perfected faith, where it doesn't need any processing in order to fully crystallize. It is a perfect, absolutely pristine crystal. And that, I believe, is random. Now, you can have whatever view you want. You can say, well, no, God's soul was perfect before the beginning because he chose it to be, which is impossible because he didn't exist before that point in order to make that choice. You can't make a choice without time. If there is no time, there is no choice. Choice is where I can make a decision about what, given what has already happened, I can decide what will happen. That's a choice. Choice requires a past and a future and a present. So if there is no past and there is no future and there is no present, then there is no choice. And therefore, the nature of God's soul just so randomly happened to be perfect. And because God's soul was perfect, God was the center, and God was the periphery and the volume, and yet none of those, because there was no space either. There was no periphery, no volume, and no center, and there was no future, present, or past. There was just God and God's perfection. And I believe that God spent an eternity of eternities, a timeless epoch, basking in God's own glory and perfection. Just eons and eons and eons. And yet also simultaneously a fraction of a single instant. Both of those are equally, again, stupid ways of trying to grab this ungrabbable idea. But anyway, so after that timeless epoch of basking in God's own glory, of perfection, just being perfect, then God folds into God's self, flipping inside out, taking the absolute extremes and folding them inward into his own center. And that is how God created everything. That's how everything began, is God folding into God's self. And that's why I say, for us, with our view, we are unfolding because God folded into God's self in order to create everything. Then, on the side of creation, if you were to think of a piece of paper, okay, and you took the corners of it and you cut a hole in the center, and you folded the corners into the center, and then you pulled them down past the center, then they would unfold on the other side and come right back out to where they began, right? So that's how everything is flowing. It's flowing in this sort of a churning, almost like a cavitating bubble sort of a way. And that being imperfect necessarily, because it was different than what it was, makes it necessarily hell for God. So God suffered the instant that he began creating. And he did so ostensibly knowing better, or at the very least having faith despite that. So this is why I find people who can go through really severe shit and not become embittered by it, but even if they're crying, smile and still actually retain that faith that it doesn't matter. That strength is so inspiring to me. That is as close to God as I've ever seen, is somebody that can go through something I can't even comprehend, that is so purely evil that I don't have words for it, And yet on the other side of that, they're smiling. How can you get closer to God than that? So that, I believe, is what God does all the time. And he is paying for our sins. Not just paid in the past, paying. Always. And it gets worse for God, not better. Because, like I said, after every crystallization, there is, I want you to picture, okay, so there's this void space right after God folded inward. That's where the corners meet the center hole. Okay? So as soon as that happens, as soon as creation begins, then you've got an infinite void. That infinite void becomes established as one infinite void. And that one infinite void is then crystalline. And this is where we get the inertial momentum from which the Big Bang singularity emerges. Where did all that infinite energy come from? It comes from the inertial momentum of nothing, being nothing. So in this void space, nothing moves, nothing changes, nothing happens. There is no imperfection anywhere. But it is an assemblage. It is a thing. It's an instance of nothing, or it's a space within which there is nothing, or there is a time in which nothing happened. That paradoxical origin is where everything began. And it's the beginning of God's suffering, because that crystallization of inertial momentum, of nothing being nothing, just sitting there being nothing, and nothing changing, creates a resistance to change, which is mass. So it has infinite mass because it resists all change. And yet, because it has that infinite mass, it has infinite energy. And energy is change. And so it gets into this paradox where it's like, it's stuck because it's inertial, infinitely inertial. But it must move because it has energy, infinite energy. So it has infinite mass, which is resistance to change, and yet it also has infinite energy, which is change. So it has infinite resistance to change and infinite change, conjoined into a singularity. And this is what causes it to bang. And that change overrides the resistance to change. And we get creation. We get this explosion of creation. And throughout that process, everything evolves. And this is why I say that God is always with us. God's light is always shining. God's light is evolutionary. It is that which is directing us towards something better. And the evolution is the path or the method. And the light is the destination at the end of that evolution. And so God just being God, that kind of fingerprint, or as I call it, blood, bleeds in like watercolor kind of bleeds onto the canvas. God's nature bleeds into existence. And through that blood, we are saved. But that doesn't mean that we kill God, and it doesn't mean that we kill each other and shed blood and we go find some animal in the forest to go sacrifice to somehow appease God. None of that shit works. It's bullshit. And this is why, one of the reasons why I believe that Jesus was Christ, because he was like the first guy, well, maybe not the first guy, but he knew that that was bullshit. You don't save a life by killing a life. You don't heal someone by hurting someone. You don't make God feel better by making someone else feel worse. That's just stupid. And it happens to everyone. It happens to me, it happens to you, it happens to everybody except God and Jesus. And so who is Jesus? I believe that Jesus is what happens after God folds into God's self, right? I believe there's this little fractal that happened, and that's Jesus. And what it is it's like God's nature, but stuck inside creation, where it can't get out of creation. So if you thought God was perfect and awesome and badass before, when it's just God just being God in the timeless epoch before creation began, imagine how badass Jesus is for not even knowing any of that stuff, but yet still having faith in it anyway. And he's in darkness, shrouded in a void space, not basking in his own glory like God does, but enshrouded, enveloped, almost saturated by infinite darkness and evil, and yet still believes in light on the other side of that. So that's what it's all about. That was the original Jesus. Okay, now it wasn't Jesus because Jesus Christ was human. It was the Christ. That was the Christ, the original Christ of the omniversal Mandelbrot set, if you want to consider it that way, zoomed all the way out. That's the first one. So Christ is God's soul born here in this place. Jesus Christ is the human form of that. So, like I said, at the end of every crystallization, we live again. So that means Christ gets reborn. After every single time that he dies, he gets reborn into another deeper fractal. And every single time he gets born into that fractal, he lives the same kind of life that he always lives, because his faith, like God's, is perfect and unwavering. And because of that perfection, it shines all the way down to the depths of nothing. And it still won't die. It still won't waver. It still won't deviate a hair of a hair's breadth. Not the half of a quark of an atom. It is that precise and that perfect. And what is that? The faith in goodness, the faith that everything's going to be all right, the faith that there is a meaning, that people are good, that there's a purpose to everything, that despite all the suffering and the darkness, that there's light on the other side of it. And that's what it's all about, man.